Monday, November 21st. Will people, en masse, be awakened and enlightened by the imminent physical deprivation and suffering? Bruce Charlton. Since, at least in the UK, all the signs are that we are in for very severe, and all but universal, ultra-rich are exempt, of course, economic hardship and suffering. The plans have been implemented, the pieces are in place, the trend is already established, and further destructive measures are being introduced on a weekly basis. So, will people, en masse, be awakened and enlightened by our coming physical deprivation and suffering? The answer is a firm no. If people, as they currently are, were capable of being awakened and enlightened by adversity, this would have happened in 2020, or, at least, the 2020 events would have been understood for what they really were, and explicitly repented. But, although, especially in England, there has been an unexpected, and welcome, rollback of the 2020 measures, and although this indicates the English are not such a beaten people as I suspected, and less dumb and sheep-like than the Scots, Welsh, Canadians, Australians or New Zealanders, this push against measures has merely been based on mass passive disobedience, and rooted in negative, not positive, criticism, for example annoyance at inconvenience, rather than on principle. Any significant dawn of understanding has been among a few individuals, and not happened explicitly or widely. My feeling is that the people of the UK have absolutely no idea what is about to happen to them, i.e. that we are, almost all, going to become very significantly impoverished, that we will lose a large proportion, tens of percent, of our income and then wealth, from inflation and much higher taxes and, no doubt, other covert extractions. This at least, such rapid and severe changes will have unpredictable systemic consequences, that may induce societal collapse, nobody really knows. We face apparently inevitable considerable suffering, but people will not be enlightened by this suffering. At present people cannot believe what is coming because they are not yet suffering enough. Yet when enough suffering comes, shortages of food, warmth, light, fuel, basic services, they will attribute it to false causes. Apparently the UK leader, the Prime Minister, explicitly attributes the coming hardships primarily to the leader of the Fire Nation, and secondarily to Brexit, despite that the true causes were all self-imposed, and deliberately self-imposed, with solid foreknowledge of consequences. And despite that Brexit never happened. It is not enough for him even to pretend that well-intended errors led to unanticipated consequences, but nowadays an actual inversion of the truth is the preferred explanation, no doubt because opposite swirled reasoning better explains why the proposed remedial measures instead actually increase economic damage. But plenty of people seem to believe this incoherent lying. Enough to make it worth saying. People will attribute their suffering to false causes and they will therefore fail to learn from it. They will blame false causes, because their basic metaphysical assumptions are false, and wrong assumptions make it impossible to learn from experience. Metaphysics comes first. When we have wrong assumptions, we cannot discern the relevant facts, nor can we reason correctly from them. It is our basic assumptions that determine what we perceive, and what we perceive as important, and, having chosen what is important from the endless possibilities, it is our metaphysics that determines how we can put these together to make an explanation, and infer from this what to do. Since modern man assumes that we all live in a purposeless and meaningless, accidental universe, and that we humans are accidental products of purposeless evolution, and that our lives begin with random genetic combinations and we are annihilated at death, then we cannot ultimately learn anything at all concerning the true meaning and purpose of our lives. Modern man has pre-decided that he is a passive consequence of blind processes, and can only know the current state of his gratification, his happiness or suffering, which effective state is manipulated by any of those with power who consciously possess the agency and purpose that modern man denies in himself. In the country of the nihilists, the purpose of man is king. So what is the purpose of our kings? I am asking not what the kings say is their purpose, but what truly is their purpose. For any Christian who is prepared to think for himself, to ask that question is to know the answer, that the purpose of our kings is malign. Our kings want to harm us, physically, but most of all spiritually. Until modern man can recover a basis conviction of purpose, hence meaning, men will remain as they are, puppets, cattle, and prey, and will remain unable to learn from any possible kind of experience. Reaping what you sow. William Wildblood. It hasn't taken long for the results of the foolish decisions taken in early 2020 to make themselves felt. Anyone who ignored the evidence, perfectly clear early on, that the sickness was by no means as severe as presented and who allowed themselves to be terrorized by propaganda and went along enthusiastically with the home imprisonment, should now accept without complaint the inflation, the higher taxes, the whittling away of the value of their savings that are the inevitable consequences of these decisions. When you shut down an economy and splurge huge sums of money on paying people to do nothing, what do you expect? The lockdowns are not the only cause of the current monetary malaise. The fact that the financial crisis of 2008 was never properly addressed but merely had its cracks papered over is also significant. But the events of 2020 brought everything to a head. That may even have been their purpose or part of their purpose. Acclimatizing a population to loss of freedom was also important. The question is, what do those of us who are aware of the lies that brought us here and the reasons for us being in the current situation actually do? The first thing is to understand that the lies will continue. They have a purpose. They will take different forms, but the underlying direction they are pushing us towards is the same. This is the aforementioned loss of freedom. That is what lies behind the increased control, the future reduction of people's financial independence and the obligatory medical interventions. You should know that information about everything from war to the weather is manipulated and has an agenda behind it, and then you will keep yourself relatively free. Outwardly you may find your freedom restricted, but inner freedom is what matters. Preserve that. Secondly, the only way to protect yourself from what is to come is to focus on the spiritual. What is to come will come. You can't affect that. How you react to it is your task. And the only way to react correctly is to live in the spiritual world. It is true that this world is part of the spiritual world, for, ultimately, everything is spiritual. But it is part of the spiritual world that has been invaded by anti-spiritual forces, something that is possible because of the nature of the material realm, the material being the spiritual at a distance from itself. God divides being into spirit and matter, or subject and object, in order to create, and he creates to reveal himself and become more. But this means there is God and not God, or, better put, God as God and God as not God, and, though the latter is still part of God, it has the potential to lose connection to divine reality. When this happens, only those who are able to recognize that it has happened can preserve their spiritual integrity. This is what we must do now. As the outer world falls into darkness, we must work hard at maintaining our link to the inner light. It is a standard ploy of the darkness at such times to present itself as light, but we must not be deceived. The true light does not have its source in this world, and it does not seek to ratify this world or the ways of this world. You will find that there is no institution in the world that is uncorrupted now, but that is a necessary thing because it forces you to go within and to grow as a result. I do not say that the current evil is created or wished by God, but he is able to use it for divine ends. Ideally, the outer would reflect the inner. In a fallen world that doesn't happen very often. Today it is not happening at all. But that means that all those who understand what is going on must make even more of an effort to express the inner, and to do that we must live as much as possible in the inner. Everyone reaps what they sow. To reap the spiritual we must sow the spiritual. I find it extraordinary that so many people refuse to see what is taking place in front of their eyes and go along with the dismantling of their world. You could say that once you deny the spiritual, then pretty soon everything falls to pieces, and that is correct. You have no proper yardstick against which to measure what goes on. But it is not just this. People will not wake up because they are too lazy. It would mean a radical reassessment of their whole lives. It's hard to admit that you are wrong and have based your life on a lie, but the longer you put this off, the more painful it will be when you eventually have to face reality. As always, the key to spiritual awakening is repentance. Far too many people nowadays adopt a surface spirituality that is little more than an adjunct to their worldliness, as opposed to being a replacement for it. These people are easily duped by the anti-spiritual forces currently running the world, so make sure you are not one of them. You reap what you sow. Tuesday, November 22nd. Why modern man's ideologies and religion have become more truly negative. Bruce Charlton. It is very striking to me how negative are people's ideals now, compared with even 50 or 100 years ago. And I mean negative in practice, not just in theory, because there have been negative religious theories for at least a couple of thousand years, yet in practice Christians had strong positive motivations. Negative theology, via negativa, was prominent in Christianity, substantially inherited from pagan Romans and Greeks, in the early centuries AD. I mean the ascetic path of opposition to the world, elimination of temptation, and repudiation of the flesh, which was taken to the greatest extreme by the hermit desert fathers. The Neoplatonic theology, for example associated with Dionysius the Areopagite, was one of explicit negation, that asserted we cannot know God except by knowing what God is not, are dragged down by our instincts and desires. This in general downrated or rejected marriage, family, creativity as paths to God, due to their excessive risk of temptation by fleshly pleasures, binding us to mortal life, its pleasures and pains. These desires were to be overcome by prolonged disciplines of deprivation and chosen suffering, so that we may learn control of them, and ultimately independence from them. Yet, in practice, there was at this time also a very powerful yet implicit positive desire for communion with God, to emulate their idea of Jesus Christ, and to dwell spiritually in heaven even while on earth. Therefore, the true situation was one in which there was strong positive desires that were unconscious and implicit, which were disciplined and shaped by the explicit rituals and practices of a negative nature. Through human history, these unconscious and implicit positive instincts have dwindled, until many modern people are hardly aware of them, deny their validity, and often altogether deny their presence. People, especially in the West, are no longer guided by positive implicit instincts towards God, the Spirit, higher consciousness. Instead we are guided by external human-originated ideals, especially the dominant ideology of secular leftist materialism that underpins all of social and political discourse and institutions in the West. If an individual rejects the dominant ideology, he must, as a rule, do so by an explicit and consciously chosen act of will. Interestingly, even the ideology of left materialism itself has been subject to the same trends in consciousness. It has gone from containing a considerable largely unconscious and implicit positive element, to being almost wholly negative in its ideals, and oppositional in its practices. When it began to emerge a couple of hundred years ago, leftism often shared in the, mostly unconscious, positive goals of Christianity, so that there were many Christian socialists in the UK, from the Anglo-Catholic wing of the Church of England, as well as non-conformist churches, who, albeit misguidedly, saw socialism as a means to the end of a more Christian society. These were a significant cultural phenomenon into the middle 20th century. Even among the explicitly materialist atheist leftists of the late 19th century, such as the revolutionary communist William Morris and the gradualist Fabian George Bernard Shaw, there was strong, albeit untheorized, ungrounded, positive assumption concerning the goals of leftism. Such men would argue that socialism was a necessary/the best means to achieve the kind of society that was commonsensically, by appeal to universal evaluations, regarded as a good environment for positive virtues. For Morris, that was a quasi-medieval agrarian society in which the arts and crafts thrived, and were universal, a world of craftsmen and artists, for whom labor was an altruistic joy. For Shaw, it was a modern industrial society where all were allocated an equal income that made accessible all the higher things in life, arts, sciences, etc. The purpose of universal and equal prosperity was to enable men to pursue mystical goals, such as attaining higher consciousness, en route to a somewhat platonic world of pure intelligences whose gratification was contemplation, and untrammeled creativity. For the likes of Morris, Shaw and other early socialists, the desirability of such a society was self-evident, but it is no longer self-evident in 2022. Indeed, such utopian schemes are all but off the map, seldom mentioned, and so weakly believed, if at all, that such ideals are unable significantly sustain a life or even, noticeably, to influence behavior. What I mean is that, diminishing, but evident until about the middle 20th century, the underlying, even if unstated, belief even on the left was that if the obstacles to a better and higher life could be removed by socialism, or feminism, anti-racism, an economy of common ownership, etc., then a better and higher life would spontaneously emerge, because that, it was assumed, was what men wanted. And it was that better/higher life that was the ultimate justification of leftism. Well, that concept has become meaningless, and since the 1960s, as the new left has focused on negative aims, without any positive sense of where this is going, or what state of society it is trying to achieve, or what people are supposed to do and live by in a future society. Contra Morris, the arts and crafts, guilds and professions, small villages and farming as a vocation, have all declined catastrophically. And, contra Shaw, men are more, not less, focused on materialism, consumption and shallow pleasures and dissipating distractions. Underlying such changes in both Christianity and leftism is this waning of the unconscious and implicit, ultimately spiritual and self-justifying, ideal of the good life. Now we must consciously choose God, Jesus Christ, and to live by the transcendental values of divine creation. These are not longer spontaneously generated from within ourselves. On the one hand, we are freer than men used to be, because we are no longer subject to uncontrollable drives from unconscious motivations. On the other hand, if we do not choose correctly, then we are prone to purposelessness, meaninglessness and therefore despair, in a way that used to be extremely rare, even among the explicit atheists and nihilists of 100+ years ago. Altruism is not Christian love. Francis Berger. So, it turns out that the WizKid fraud at the center of the most recent collapsed crypto trading Ponzi scheme, a microcosm of the broader and all-encompassing control and scam macrocosm known as the system, was involved in something called effective altruism, which describes itself as a research field and community that aims to find the best possible ways to help others and then put these ways into practice. Sounds good, right? Before wading further into the fraudulent WizKid's much publicized, pre-scandal altruism and benevolence, it is worth evaluating the motivations and background behind this apparent love of mankind and yearning to make the world a better place by helping people. WizKid was the second largest political donator in the US behind Uncle Joe Schwartz. His parents are law professors at a prestigious Citadel of Darkness, Both have heavily participated in political lobbying. His aunt is the dean of the School of Health at another citadel of darkness and is also connected to the WEF. His brother ran a non-profit focused on guarding against the birdemic. WizKid and his family members are all clearly and deeply connected to a variety of system apparatchiks in various system sectors, including healthcare, politics, finance, education, and law. Unsurprisingly, the whole family is actively involved in all the litmus test issues, to the point that the WizKid apparently used his company as a front through which to launder money via Ukraine. I don't know about you, but do any of these people strike you as the sort who honestly strive to help people and make the world a better place? Does it look like any of them sacrificed their interests for the sake of others? If anything, the WizKid and his extended family offer a clear glimpse of some of what lies behind the system's obsessive promulgation of altruism as the highest of all virtues and moral obligations. Regardless, modern people generally embrace altruism as a high virtue, moral obligation, and guiding principle. Many consider it a high expression of love. For some, it represents the highest form of love. When the media broadcasts an individual or organization that is working to place the interests of others above its interests, modern people tend to regard such individuals or organizations as noble and virtuous. Contemporary Christians are no exception here. Most Christians think altruism is an innately Christian principle and virtue, a principle and virtue that the secular left hijacks, corrupts, and retools to serve its nefarious purposes. Within this framework of contemporary Christian thinking, the disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others is an inherent Christian good toward which all Christians should aim. Yes, leftists and atheists often abuse the principle, but this abuse should not deter Christians from practicing altruism properly, nor does it negate the Christian goodness contained within the principle. In fact, one of the best things a modern Christian can do is demonstrate the correct spirit of altruism and show the secular atheist what selfless service to others means and how it should be done. And Christian effective altruism, the same thing the Ponzi scheme WizKid supported but with a Christian twist, offers the contemporary Christian the perfect avenue through which to do just that, bold added. Service to others is a pillar of Christianity. Jesus taught that helping those in need was one of the most important aspects of life for just about anyone. Jesus went as far as to suggest that people should help others as much as possible. For example, Jesus praised those who would give so much to the poor that they themselves became poor. With such strong emphasis on helping till it hurts in the New Testament, one would expect to see Christians today putting altruism, or producing a positive change in the world, at the forefront of their lives. The world in which Jesus lived was vastly different from the world today. Life was centered on one's own community, and people had limited knowledge or ability to communicate with the rest of the world. Helping others in the ancient world was probably a simple affair consisting of giving to beggars or local organizations that helped the poor or sick. It is therefore understandable that the altruism espoused in the Bible was simple and local, with an emphasis on quantity, i.e., sacrifice. Today's world is much more complex and global. Helping others is, therefore, also more complicated, with countless possible options. It would be a mistake to assume that Christ would advocate to limit altruism to your own community or to directly helping the sick or poor if he were alive today. The fundamental message of Jesus' teachings of altruism was to help others, or improve the world, as much as possible. In the 21st century, this requires a scientific approach that uses research and reason to optimize outcomes. Christians today have not been heeding the call of Christ to make a sincere, robust effort at helping people. We sacrifice little and help others based on the benefit to ourselves rather than to society. Only by practicing effective altruism can we live up to Christ's expectations. By utilizing scientific principles, we can determine which actions are most worth pursuing, and which should be relegated to a lower priority. Tools such as randomized controlled trials and surveys make it possible to estimate the effectiveness of various interventions in helping others, guiding our actions with evidence and compassion. Listen, Christians who believe that sounds even remotely Christian needs to seriously re-evaluate their understanding of what living up to Christ's expectations really means. I'll cut right to the chase. Altruism is not a Christian principle or virtue. Moreover, it never was. Leftism didn't hijack altruism from Christianity and corrupt it. Christianity absorbed altruism from leftism. Unfortunately, this absorption has severely distorted, contaminated, and misrepresented authentic Christian love. There are many problems with altruism. For the sake of brevity, I'll focus on the simple fact that it was Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, who coined the term. Comte's concept of altruism derives from the French autrui, other, or other people, which in turn comes from the Latin later, meaning other. Comte's ethical doctrine of altruism is rooted in the insistence that individuals are morally obligated to put the interests of others above their self-interest for the sake of society. Here's the kicker: Comte rejected metaphysics and theism outright. He did not believe in anything spiritual. Instead, he believed in the sociological law of three stages, in which his positivist stage, a philosophical system that accepted only that which could be scientifically recognized or proven via logic or mathematics, represented the pinnacle of human development, ranking far above the necessary yet inferior theological and metaphysical stages of social development, both of which needed to be abandoned. Though Comte denied the reality of God and creation, he valued the social utility of religion, so much so, that he ended up creating a secular religion, aptly called the religion of humanity. I have rambled on about all of this because I have spent the last couple of days thinking about a recent post on Dr. Charlton's Notions blog. The post was a succinct and penetrating summation of what is best, deepest, and most important about the work of Rudolf Steiner as provided by the late editor-in-chief of Steiner Books, Christopher Bamford. The following lists the main points. We are already, here and now, living in a spiritual world. Our habits of reductionist positivistic thinking are what actually materialize the world. Everything is consciousness, and all consciousness is of a being which is conscious. We inhabit a world of beings in relationships. So, reality consists of relationships in consciousness. These relationships continue after that transformation which is death. The purpose of the earth and men, what this world is essentially for, is the creation of relationships. And this is vital because only on earth and among men can beings learn to love. The most important thing, in reality, is the cultivation of love, and the development of consciousness of love. Love and freedom are needed and inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. The most important activity of the universe takes place on earth. The rest of reality participates in the development of love between beings on earth. Within that excellent summary, Dr. Charlton provides two amplifications of Bamford's points that resonated deeply with me. This is creation. Our life on earth is spiritual. This spiritual life is about love, and this love is creation. Creation is made of love, and the aim of evolution is to develop this love and consciousness of love. Love among men is not sufficient, but it is essential. The first commandment to love God, and the second commandment to love fellow men are no longer, since Christ, possible to separate. Both are necessary for each other. Dr. Charlton's post on Bamford/Steiner raises many vital questions that require immediate reflection. Among these, one struck me as particularly significant. Since our life on earth is spiritual, and the purpose of this life on earth is the establishment of relationships through which to learn how to love, to cultivate love via consciousness, then what sort of love should people be aiming for, learning, and cultivating? The answer is simple. Christian love. True Christian love. The kind that does not include altruism, effective or otherwise. Wednesday, November 23rd. Looking back, mere nostalgia, or real history becoming more mythical? Or, being a romantic? Bruce Charlton. Jeremy, sometimes I have a queer feeling that, if one could go back, one would find not myth dissolving into history, but rather the reverse, real history becoming more mythical, more shapely, discernibly significant, even seen at close quarters. More poetical, and less prosaic, if you like. From the Notion Club Papers, by J.R.R. Tolkien. It is often said that nostalgia is merely a selective memory of the past seen through rose-tinted spectacles, but that ignores the sometimes different quality of the past, which is captured in the quotation above. In other words, we mythologize our past, and the past of our tribe, culture, nation, not by leaving out the bad stuff, but because the past actually was more poetical, less prosaic. For instance, when I look back on my education, my working years, or my engagement with literature and music, I perceive a trajectory from the somewhat mythic and poetic to the historical and mundane, which was substantially to do with how I experienced life, and not just a product of the retrospectoscope through which I view them. And those periods of my life when, for whatever reason, my life lacked this mytho-poetic quality, lacked shapeliness, I both knew at the time, and recall it now. In other words, I am not nostalgic for the mundane times, no matter how worldly successful or pleasurable they may have been or seemed at the time. And I have read enough first-person contemporary accounts of the past, memoirs, diaries, letters etc., to realize that things seemed different then from how they seem to us now. Regular readers will be familiar with my favored explanation of the development of man's consciousness as understood by Rudolf Steiner and, especially, Owen Barfield, such that both our individual development and the development of, at least Western, societies has been affected by a divine purposive change in men's consciousness, both individually, and on average through time. The past has a different, more mythical and poetic, quality, because we ourselves, or past men, had a different relationship with each other and the world, such that there was not then the same boundary as we now experience between us and them, inner and outer, subjective and objective, the individual and his culture or environment. Nor the same boundary between men on the one hand, and animals, plants and landscape. Then we were, to a significant extent, immersed in all these other things, and reality was different for us as we were then, differently from us as we are now. And it is this immersion that distinguishes myth from history. I am one of those people who regard this matter as of central importance to my life, and life in general, and who desire to live again in a more poetic and mythic way. In other words, I am a romantic, and have been since my early teens, although there have been significant phases when I fought this trait of mine as strenuously as I knew how. It was, indeed, this romanticism that kept me away from the truth of Christianity for so long, because Christianity as is does not, or does not adequately, address this problem of romanticism. Indeed, some Christian churches and theologies make matters even worse from the point of view of draining the magic from life and history. And it is this which drove me to seek, discover, and co-create this romantic Christianity which I, and a few others, are expounding. Of course I regard romantic Christianity as truer and superior to other ways of Christianity, but I would not have had the long-term drive to seek/discover/create romantic Christianity if it had not been for the intractable trait of romanticism in myself, and my dissatisfaction with any worldview, religion or ideology that denied it. It is spiritually impossible for a Christian to be altruistic. Francis Berger. In yesterday's post I pointed out that altruism is not a Christian principle or virtue. I also had the audacity to declare that it was objectionable for Christians to pursue and engage in altruism. In this post I'm going to kick it up a notch and illustrate why aspiring to altruism is a spiritual impossibility for Christians. Put another way, Christians who involve themselves with altruism are involved with a principle that is utterly incompatible with being a Christian. People can be altruists, or they can be Christians, but they cannot be both. The very notion of an altruistic Christian is a self-contradiction, an oxymoron par excellence. To begin with, altruism, in its purest definition, is an anti-Christian principle because it denies the reality of God. It thereby negates the first Christian commandment to love God. It also negates the second Christian commandment to love the neighbor because it rejects the spiritual reality of man. Those who engage in altruism do not practice Christian love, which is an act directed at the concrete, real, spiritual person, at the innermost reality of what makes a person a person. Instead they practice what Auguste Comte defined as the moral obligation to renounce the self to live for the other. Comte believed this total submission of the self to others was vital to the benefit and progress of society, which in Comte's positivism supplants the role of God. In my post from yesterday, I included two of Dr. Charlton's amplifications from Christopher Bamford's distillation of Rudolf Steiner's teaching concerning the purpose of mortal life on earth. These were: this is creation. Our life on earth is spiritual, this spiritual life is about love, and this love is creation. Creation is made of love, and the aim of evolution is to develop this love and consciousness of love. Love among men is not sufficient, but it is essential. The first commandment to love God, and the second commandment to love fellow men are no longer, since Christ, possible to separate. Both are necessary for each other. As Dr. Charlton notes, since Christ, it is insufficient to love God exclusively or to love one's neighbors exclusively. To be a Christian, to truly practice and create Christian love, one must love God and love one's neighbors inclusively. The two cannot be separated, which renders the altruistic moral obligation to renounce God for the sake the other nugatory. Also, the second Christian commandment also calls on Christians to love their neighbors as they love themselves. Thus, self-love also becomes inseparable from love of the neighbor. A Christian who loves God and his neighbor must also love himself. Any Christian who does not love himself is incapable of truly loving God or the neighbor because he is denying the value and worth of his own spiritual essence. Then there is also the question of ultimate purpose. In a comment from yesterday's post, William Wildblood asks the following, bold-added: what is the purpose of altruistic action even assuming the altruism is genuine? To make the world a better place? To relieve suffering and spread happiness? That has nothing to do with Christian love, which is directed solely to bringing a soul closer to God. In other words, Christian love is focused on spiritual ends. It is not well-meaning, it does not have good intentions, and it is not benevolent. Christian love derives from God and seeks to bring everything back to God. Dr. Charlton picked up on this point and added, bold-added, William W.'s question is worth bringing to mind in such discussions: what is the purpose of altruistic action even assuming the altruism is genuine? The problem with the world is that it is fundamentally unsatisfactory, ultimately because everything in it decays and dies. We need to evaluate ethical claims in the light of spiritual purpose that addresses this fact. To my mind, the desirability of any specific altruistic act should be evaluated in terms of being a means to some positive end, lacking which it is just moving deck chairs on the Titanic. Short answer: altruism offers no positive end for Christians, not even in cases when the altruistic action is genuine. Though I have known this intuitively for quite some time, it was Max Scheler who brought the incompatibility of altruism and Christian love home for me via his short philosophical treatise, Resentiment, bold-added. Finally, the resentiment character of modern humanitarianism is also proved by the fact that its leading spokesman, for example, Auguste Comte, describe it as altruism. For the Christian conception of love, Devotion to one's fellow man merely because he is the other is as false and misplaced as the liberal individualistic idea that we best serve the whole and the community by perfecting ourselves. According to the saying, when the rose adorns itself, it adorns the garden. In the Christian view, love is an act of a particular quality, directed at the ideal spiritual person as such, and it makes no difference whether it is the person of the lover or that of the other. That is why the Christian considers it sinful to renounce one's salvation for somebody else's sake. And therefore his own salvation is as important to him as love of his neighbor. Love God and thy neighbor as thyself, is the Christian precept. It is characteristic that a leading spokesman of modern humanitarianism, Auguste Comte, the inventor of the term altruism, which is a barbarism, takes offense at this postulate. He accuses Christianity of aiding and abetting egoistic impulses because it commands us to care for our own salvation as well, and he wants to replace this precept by the new positivistic commandment, love thy neighbor more than thyself. He fails to see that Christian love is a particular kind of spiritual act, which is by its very essence primarily oriented toward the spiritual person, of God and men, and toward the body merely as its vessel and temple. Thus the relation to the other is not an essential characteristic of Christian love, and Christianity necessarily knows a self-love which is basically different from all egoism. Comte fails to note that it is incomprehensible why our fellow man should have a right to benefaction, since love, for Comte, has value only as a cause for good deeds, for the silliest of reasons, simply because he is the other. If I myself am not worthy of love, why should the other be? As if he were not also an I, for himself, and I another, for him. Comte ignores that his tenet is either a hyperbolical pathetic phrase or a nihilistic demand which destroys all vitality and indeed decomposes any structure of being. But the real question is how such a demand is psychologically explicable. There is a delusion which consists in mistaking for love what is really a peculiar sham form of love, founded on self-hatred and self-flight. In his Pensées, Blaise Pascal has drawn the classic picture of a type of man who is entangled in many worldly activities, games, sports, hunting, also business or unceasing work for the community, and all this merely because he cannot look at himself and continually tries to escape from the vacuum, from his feeling of nothingness. In some psychoses, for example, in hysteria, we find a kind of altruism in which the patient has become incapable of feeling and experiencing anything by himself. All his experiences are sympathetic, built on those of another person and his possible attitude and expectation, his possible reaction to any event. The patient's own existence has lost its center and focus, he neglects all his affairs, is completely drawn into the other's life, and suffers from it. He eats nothing or injures himself in order to vex the other. In a milder form, the same phenomenon occurs in the movement of universal humanitarian love. This attitude sometimes takes the form of a collective delusion, as within the Russian intelligentsia, especially the academic youth of both sexes, which likes to inject its morbid urge for self-sacrifice and self-flight into social and socio-political goals and then interprets its morbidity as moral heroism. The social politician who troubles his head about everything except himself and his own business, a type now increasingly frequent, is usually nothing but a poor and empty human being fleeing from himself. Nietzsche is perfectly right in pointing out that this way of living and feeling is morbid, a sign of declining life and hidden nihilism, and that its superior morality is pretense. His criticism, however, does not touch the Christian love of one's neighbor, it does touch an essential component of modern love of mankind, which is in effect fundamentally a socio-psychological phenomenon of degeneration. In the fourth Gospel, Christ instructs us to love one another, which points to the real purpose of the earth and men, what this world and our mortal lives are essentially for, the creation of relationships from which beings can learn to love. Bearing this in mind, it becomes quite clear that altruism can teach Christians nothing about love. Quite the contrary. The The only thing altruism can teach Christians is how to abandon spirituality and submit to materialism, reductionism, positivism, and atheism. Once a Christian willingly and actively submits to altruism, that Christian stops being a Christian, because it is spiritually impossible for a Christian to embrace altruism and remain Christian. No wonder the system demands that Christians be altruistic. Thursday, November 24th. Causation versus free agency. Bruce Charlton. It is an implicit assumption of modern culture and life that everything is caused, except what is random. Because everything is caused, it is assumed that these causes, if known, are like the laws of science and entail exactly what happens. But there is also randomness, chance, the undetermined, which is, somehow, in an unprincipled way, also incorporated into the everything is caused determinism by means of statistical properties. If reality really is caused, then this fundamental incorporation of randomness doesn't make any coherent sense, as Einstein clearly saw. Nonetheless, it has happened. Randomness is incorporated into a deterministic worldview, and is justified on the basis that it works to predict things. Or rather, attributed randomness sometimes seems to work, because whether something works depends on, essentially arbitrary, prior decisions about what counts as having worked, or alternatively failed to work. And this becomes even less precise when what counts as having worked gets defined retrospectively to include, or indeed be entirely, what has already happened, as with climate change predictions. Yet, there is no such thing as randomness in real life, and therefore no probability. These are actually just mathematical tools, that may be useful in particular situations, although the nature of scope of the situations in which it is valid cannot be known. In practice, the validity of particular instances of statistical reasoning is a matter of common sense, or more likely the exercise of power to control discourse. But what of free agency, free will, or what you call it? I mean the thinking of beings, especially men, at those times when they are thinking with their real and divine selves. Accepting that men may, often do, behave automatically, and are not free at all times, but only potentially and sometimes. Free agency cannot be either caused/determined, or random/statistical. Free agency must be something other, which is expressive of a being itself, arises wholly from that being, and not, therefore, a product of causes acting upon that being. To cut the argument short, I believe that genuine free agency is either an incomprehensible mystery and gift from God, which is the mainstream/classical Christian view, or else, as I believe, free agency is a property of beingness, to be found to a greater or lesser extent in all beings. Which means that all beings have a divine aspect. Which means that while there is one God who is creator of this creation we inhabit, creation itself consists of beings who are all gods in this vital sense of having some potential degree of free agency. In other words, reality is alive and conscious and consists of beings/gods that are in relationships with one another, in some real way, but varied between beings. If so, then what is the role of causation? My understanding is that causation is a series of hypotheses that are useful in inverse proportion to the exercise of free agency. In a world where free agency is seldom exercised, then causation is highly predictive. Here in mortal life upon Earth, things are different according to different times and places, and among different individuals. But the more that agency is active, the less causality is operative. In a world where free agency is ignored or denied, and its effects are suppressed, causal thinking, and its bastard offspring randomness, appears to operate as a complete explanation of reality. Hence the common idea that, in principle, science can explain everything that is real. In other words, Western man has, for some generations, been living at, or near to, an extreme where free agency is hardly a factor in life, and where, because of this exclusion, causal and determinative thinking seems to work very well as an explanation, for prediction, and to manipulate the world, including people. Conversely, in a world where free agency is highly frequent and determines thought, there is very little for causal thinking to explain. At the extreme, in heaven, I assume that almost everything is a consequence of free agency in the context of relationships between beings. Things happen because they are willed to happen. Therefore, in heaven there is essentially no causation, but only free agency and relationships. There is a further aspect governing the operations of free agency, which is the extent to which it is groupish or individual. If we focus on men, then in the past free agency seems to have been much more active than now. Hence prediction was anthropomorphic, in terms of personal factors such as motivations, desires and relationships. But this ancient agency was not individualistic, it operated at a groupish level such as the clan, tribe, village, guild, or even, later, the nation. Thus, understanding and prediction treated groups as we might regard individuals, and focused on their attitudes to each other, strengths and weaknesses etc. Modern agency has, however, become very individualistic, and insofar as free agency genuinely exists and is deployed, which is apparently not much, very seldom, it operates at the personal level rather than in groups. What appears superficially to be group agency, is actually a product of causal and determinative thinking, manipulating individuals, e.g. via laws, rules and propaganda, to conform behavior to external will. Part of this manipulation is to encourage individuals to believe they are already living by free agency, when in fact they have switched off their own agency, and are thinking almost entirely in terms of automatic, mundane, externally inculcated and imposed concepts and information. To conclude, the destiny which God wishes from men is to live by free agency, individually exercised, and voluntarily to choose to align this free agency with God's desires for His creation. But this is a choice. Some choose not to use free agency, and even to deny its reality, while others use this agency to reject the divine hopes and plans, and instead to serve the adversaries of God. In other words, such men choose not to be free. And probably this applies to most men, at least in the West. At the most basic level, service to the adversary entails opening one's own soul to thinking hostile to God, and this often takes the form of dishonestly pretending to an individual agency which is, in fact, being denied and suppressed. Thinking therefore, i.e. here and now, in this world that has rejected God, becomes a thing very much causally determined. Men's behaviors become understandable by reduction to causal reasoning and statistics. Men become predictable and controllable. Friday, November 25th. Vigano, there can be no neutrality. Francis Berger. What can I say? The Archbishop is one of the very few within organized Christianity who gets it. If I didn't know better, I would swear His Eminence has been reading romantic Christian blogs. Excerpted from this source, read the rest there, bold added here. If you start from this evidence, you will understand that it is not possible to pretend that what is happening before our eyes is solely the result of profit-seeking or the desire for power. Certainly, the economic part cannot be disregarded, considering how many people have collaborated with the World Economic Forum. And yet, beyond profit, there are unstated purposes that stem from a theological vision, one that is turned upside down, it's true, but still theological, a vision that sees two opposing sides, the side of Christ and the side of the Antichrist. There can be no neutrality, because when there is a clash between two armies, those who choose not to fight are also making a choice that affects the outcome of the battle. On the other hand, how is it possible to recognize in your noble and high professions the admirable order that the Creator has placed in nature, from the constellations of stars to the particles of the atom, and then deny that man is also part of this order, with his moral sense, his laws, his culture, and his discoveries? How can man, who is God's creature, presume to not be subject himself to eternal and perfect laws? Our battle is not against creatures made of flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers, against the rulers of this world of darkness, against the spirits of evil that dwell in the heavenly places. F 6:12. On the one hand, there is the city of God, the one Saint Augustine writes about, and on the other hand there is the city of the devil. We can say that in this era the city of the devil is clearly identifiable in Neo-Malthusian globalism, the New World Order, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and in all those so-called philanthropical foundations that follow an ideology of death, disease, destruction, and tyranny. And also in those forces that have infiltrated the institutions, which we call the deep state and the deep church. On the other front, we must recognize that the city of God is more difficult to identify. Even the religious authorities appear to have betrayed their role of giving guidance to the faithful, preferring to serve power and propagate their lies. The very people who ought to be protecting and sanctifying souls are scattering and scandalizing them, calling good Christians rigid fundamentalists. As you can see, the attack is on several fronts, and thus it is a mortal threat for humanity, striking at both the body and the soul. And yet, precisely at a time when it is difficult to find authoritative points of reference, both in the religious sphere as well as the temporal one, we see an ever-increasing number of those who are understanding, opening their eyes, and recognizing the criminal mind behind the evolution of events. It is now clear that everything is linked together, without having to dismiss those who say so as conspiracy theorists. The conspiracy is already there. We are not inventing it, we are simply denouncing it, hoping that people wake up from this suicidal narcosis and demand that someone put an end to the global coup. The operations of social engineering and mass manipulation have demonstrated beyond any doubt that this crime was premeditated, and how it is consistent with a spiritual vision of the conflict that is now unfolding. It is necessary to take sides and fight, without giving in. The truth, which is an attribute of God, cannot be cancelled by error, and life cannot be defeated by death. Remember that the Lord, who has said of himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," has already defeated Satan, and what remains of the battle serves only to give us the opportunity to make the right choice, to choose to do those actions which place us under the banner of Christ, on the side of good. I trust that this great work you are undertaking will soon bear its expected fruits, putting an end to a time of trial in which we see how the world will become if we do not turn to Christ, if we continue to think that we can coexist with evil, lying, and self-worship. After all, the city of God is the model of those who live in God's love, self-control, and contempt for the world. The city of the devil is the model of those who live in self-love, conforming to the world and despising God. I thank you and bless you all. Researching the nature of heaven, in order to decide whether, or not, you want to go there. Bruce Charlton. I don't think the nature of heaven can be understood by direct assault on the problem, but only via several prior stages of discernment. Note, this is not what I myself did. My own procedure was much more haphazard, but it strikes me in retrospect that progress only occurred with a linear sequence of intuitive assumptions. First we need to decide what God wants with creation, including why, and how this purpose relates to man. In different words, where is creation aiming, and how do I personally fit in? It is necessary also, either at this, or some other, point, to understand how and why the life/death/resurrection/ascension of Jesus Christ was necessary to this aim. If Jesus is not considered absolutely necessary to God's plan for creation, then there is no compelling reason to be a Christian. Then we can move on to the question of what kind of heaven God would want, what fits in with God's creative intent for man. At some such point, the focus can shift to yourself, and the question of what it is that situation you would most want after your death, especially if it is forever. And only then does it make much sense to research the various heavens that have been described through history, because only then will you have criteria to evaluate them, their coherence and believableness, and to exercise your intuitive discernment about which heaven, or aspects of the heavens described, is plausible and desirable. In researching heaven, I read a wide range of descriptions of Christian heaven. These included: Fourth Gospel, John. Books of Revelation. Pauline Epistles. Evangelical Church of England. Roman Catholic. Russian Orthodox. Mormon, CJCLDS. William Markle. Swedenborg. Rudolf Steiner. Only after something like this prolonged quest did I reach the very simple understanding of heaven that I now believe. Saturday, November 26th. Intra-Christian, inter-denominational, hostility, and the cure in core, romantic, Christianity. Bruce Charlton. I find it very annoying when Christians fight among themselves, perhaps especially in this era, these end times, when the Christian churches are shriveling and spiritually eviscerated, and have joined with the powers of evil dominate all the Western nations, and nearly all the major social and political institutions of the world. My evaluation is that real Christians are now rare, and are scattered across many denominations and churches, despite that individually all of the denominations and churches are net corrupted by their convergence with significant policies of atheist materialist leftism, as evidenced by the litmus tests. In such a situation, it is maddening to find too many Christians having a go at each other, Western and Eastern Catholics sniping and snarking, Catholics denigrating Protestants from the rich well of historical grievances, and vice versa, both of these denigrating Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and all the church-obedient Christians excluding Christians who are unaffiliated. It is maddening but inevitable, for so long as each denomination, church, sect claims exclusivity as to salvation or theosis with respect to whatever it regards as vitally important. Such exclusivity seems almost impossible to avoid when each group has a complex and multiple set of self-definitions that are regarded as essential to being a Christian, or of being the kind of Christian that is at all worth being. Yet it is clear that the liberal alternative, pursued for more than 2 centuries, of loosening and relaxing the criteria for being a Christian, by permitting more and more latitude, by taking the old laws, rules and exclusions less and less seriously, has been a colossal disaster. Liberal Christianity leads, not to a new and more comprehensive Christianity, but to a subordination of Christianity to politics, specifically to leftist politics. And leftist politics leads to destruction of churches, assimilation to evil, and the enlistment of self-identified Christians to the strategies and policies of Satan. What is needed is twofold. First, a core Christianity, few and simple definitions by means of which a real Christian can discern the realness of others who claim to be Christian, whatever their denomination or church may be. And secondly, a shift away from the primacy of churches and to the full responsibility of individuals as the basis of Christianity, i.e. romantic Christianity. These factors can be distinguished, but are inseparable. It is the simple definitions of core Christianity that enable romantic Christianity to be tough, incisive and positive in content. And it is the personal responsibility of romantic Christianity that enable core Christianity to escape from the elaborate, and institutionally self-serving, claims of particular churches. Romantic Christianity without the clarity of core Christianity would drift away from Christianity. Core Christianity without the individual responsibility of romantic Christianity would never get off the ground, because each church would simply implement its own already established, exclusive and excluding, definitions of Christianity. Put together, core and romantic Christianity offer a way out of the current impasse, and a way by which real Christians may be allied in their faith, across a wide range of churches and outside churches, while excluding those who are not Christian. No contempt for the only place we can learn to love. Francis Berger. In this brief post I would like to refer back to a passage Dr. Charlton shared in his summary of Christopher Bamford's distillation of Rudolf Steiner's core teachings. The purpose of the earth and men, what this world is essentially for, is the creation of relationships. And this is vital because only on earth and among men can beings learn to love. I return to this passage again for two reasons. First, it is a reminder that God created this world as fit for purpose. Moreover, He offered us mortal life in it to serve a positive purpose. Second, it suggests that our experience in this world, despite its inherent temporariness, tribulations, temptations, and trials, is a great gift. Also, during the brief time we have in this world, we have the opportunity to accept, participate in, and expand this great gift, despite everything. More correctly, precisely because of everything. If we accept, participate in and expand the great gift in this world, then we will learn how to love. Once we have learned how to love, our purpose in this world will be fulfilled, and we be offered the choice to leave all temporariness, tribulation, and temptation behind. So be of good cheer and stop treating the world with nothing but resentment, scorn, and contempt. Satan had nothing but resentment, scorn, and contempt for God and creation. He is now the prince of this world, but only of the part that refuses to learn how to love. Once we commit to learning to love, we overcome the disgust and anger the prince's world generates in us and align ourselves with God's divine creative purposes in this world. So, create those relationships. That's what you're here for. And when you have created relationships, focus on co-creating love. Learn from the love that is cultivated. Strive to create more of it, then make it eternal. Sunday, November 27th. Contemplation, Enjoyment, and Creation. Bruce Charlton. It has become ever clearer to me that one of the convictions that underlies my metaphysical assumptions is that man's creative ability is real, yet mainstream, classical, traditional Christian theology has no place for men to be able genuinely to create, that is, for a man to be able to add something new to God's existing creation. This exclusion of the possibility of creation is a consequence of the mainstream Christian's understanding of the nature and attributes of God. God is assumed to have created everything from nothing, creation ex nihilo, and to live outside of time, such that God knows everything that including all possible futures, and to be omnipotent and omniscient. Putting all of these together, for the mainstream classical theology divine creation has been done wholly by God, has already happened, and is complete and unchangeable, since it is beyond time. From this perspective, there are two basic ways we can know, which C.S. Lewis terms contemplation and enjoyment, and which are described and explained in this essay, but without using the contemplation-enjoyment nomenclature, which distinction is explained in his autobiography Surprised by Joy, and elsewhere. For a classical, mainstream Christian theologian like Lewis, contemplation and enjoyment are the only possible ways of conscious knowing, with enjoyment a higher form of knowing. There will also be ways of unconscious knowing, in the sense of animals, or plants, that implicitly know many things, because they behave adaptively, but without possessing what most people would recognize as explicit, conscious awareness of their knowing. However, I believe they do, because everything does possess some consciousness, of some type. Contemplation is when we retain the stance of a separate observer. It is, in effect, knowing about something. For a Christian, a man might contemplate God, or the works of God, and this means knowing about such things, by paying attention, having experiences, studying, learning. A higher form of knowing God would be enjoyment, or communion. This would be when someone, perhaps a saint, or a resurrected man in heaven, inhabited the divine mind, able to perceive and know God by means of a direct connection, becoming joined with God's creative will, but retaining one's own identity as a distinct creature, created individual. Man in full communion with the divine remains conscious of himself, but knows God's work from the inside, and knows his own part in it. It is this retaining of personal identity that differentiates the Christian understanding of divine communion, from the Eastern, Hindu, Buddhist etc. idea of nirvana, in which the individual man loses his distinction, his self, and becomes dissolved back into the divine whole, from which he originated. But communion is not creative, since creation is done. What seems like creation to mortal men is, by this analysis, a result of our limited perspective, and is actually just a selection and arrangement of already created material. For the mainstream classical Christian, men cannot truly create, in a primary sense, because men are creatures/created beings, and only God is capable of true creation. But for me, as for C.S. Lewis's best friend Owen Barfield, there is a higher state than enjoyment, which is creation, or what Barfield terms final participation. This includes communion, but also involves knowing oneself to be adding to and enhancing already existing divine creation, that is, becoming a co-creator of God's creation. Therefore, man can, potentially, become a creator with God, creating in harmony with what already exists. It can be seen that for co-creation to be true, several of the classical mainstream assumptions about God must be discarded. Because it can be added to, creation is no longer regarded as existing outside time, nor as being complete and finished. Man is no longer understood as wholly a creature, but as an embryonic God, capable of developing to participate in primary creation of that which is new and unforeseen. Thus, a recognition of man as potential creator goes with a rejection of the assumptions that God is omnipotent and omniscient, that God created everything from nothing, and that creation is complete and beyond time. Instead, creation is recognized as ongoing, within time, incomplete and capable of expansion. In other words, creation is God's original project, and a project in which men may develop to participate. To summarize, if we are to regard man as capable of real creation, we must reject the classical, mainstream, tradition Christian theology, and adopt different metaphysical assumptions concerning God, creation and time. Conversely, if we choose instead to adhere to the classical, mainstream, tradition Christian theology, we must reject the possibility of man being a true creator, and assume instead that the highest form of being that man can aspire to is an ultimately passive state of enjoyment in communion with God. How to decide between these incompatible metaphysical explanations of Christianity, apart from intuition? The Bible as a whole is apparently ambivalent and self-contradicting on this topic, but the fourth Gospel, of John, especially chapters 13 to 17 inclusive, strongly suggests that men, in the new dispensation of Christ, can and should aspire to become co-creators, that is loving friends of Jesus Christ and God, rather than, as in the previous era, before Christ, merely obedient servants of God.